Welcome to Agile Beyond Software Development, Understanding Agile's Versatility. My name's Emily Reynolds. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a white woman with medium length dark brown hair, wearing a lime green shirt with butterflies on it. I am a business analyst and CRM administrator on DoIT's enterprise CRM team, and I'll be your moderator for this panel. Our panelists today are Beth Richardson, a software engineer and developer in DoIT Web Platforms and Services, Julie Johnson in DoIT Testing and Cyber Defense, and Lucas Gallagher, a DevOps cloud engineer from the School of Medicine and Public Health. Please place your questions in the chat as we go, and I'll read them to our presenter. I will hold questions until the Q&A portion of the panel, unless one is directly related to something just said. And now I will turn it over to Beth to start the discussion. Thanks, Beth.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can see it okay. Great. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Beth Richardson. I use she, her pronouns. For a quick visual description, I'm a white woman in my late 30s with curly brown hair. I'm going to talk about how my team uses Agile in the UW-Madison profile service. I won't be going into details about our service today, but I will drop a link to our service page into the chat after my portion of the presentation, just in case you have questions. So to give some background, I began working in 2008 as a web developer in IT and marketing. And during that time, I followed a waterfall methodology for large projects, meaning following a clearly sequenced plan. And in 2014, I joined the UW-Madison School of Business web team and began using Agile. And during this time, I also completed Scrum Facilitator certification. And in 2019, I joined DoIT and began working on UW-Madison Profile, where we currently use Agile and Scrum. And in 2022, I became the product owner of the Profile service while continuing as a developer on the team. So first, I have some quick slides on Agile and Scrum terms in case you're new to these methods. So first, Agile. Agile is a project management methodology defined by the Agile Alliance as the ability to create and respond to change in order to succeed in an uncertain and turbulent environment. And it's flexible. So Agile itself doesn't define specific types of work cycles, just that you're working in cycles. And mainly, it's a paradigm shift. So compared to the waterfall project management approach, it shifts how we think about projects. And I'll talk about this in a bit. Scrum is a team collaboration framework within which people can address complex adaptive problems while productively and creatively delivering products of the highest possible value. And that definition comes from the Scrum Alliance. So Scrum introduces more structure. You work in specific sprint cycles. Scrum has defined roles such as product owner and Scrum facilitator, as well as defined ceremonies like planning, review, retrospectives, and daily Scrum or stand-up meetings. So how is Agile a paradigm shift? So on this slide, I have a diagram with two triangles. And on the top of the diagram is what is fixed about both approaches. And then what on the bottom is what is estimated. Or changes over time. So the triangle on the left, a waterfall, is a plan-driven approach. So you fix the scope. That is, you plan ahead of time exactly what is in scope for the project, what must be done, what are the requirements to consider the project done, and you estimate the cost or resources and the time it will take as best you can. And as the plan is worked through, the project may go over budget, it may take longer, or you may need to stop at a certain point at which you might need to reduce what you're delivering as the project ends. On the right, Agile, you can see you fix the cost and time. So you work in a set period of time, such as a 2-week sprint, and you have a specific Agile team, so the resources dedicated to the project working on that. And then you estimate the scope. So you estimate the features that you'll implement, and you prioritize the minimum viable product for quality. So you're aiming to first release whatever the minimum amount of scope is, and then you continue to build upon that, but you're estimating the amount of scope that you'll reach. So I would say neither approach is better than the other. It really depends on the information you have going into the project. If your requirements and scope are very well known ahead of time, waterfall can work well because you can set out that plan and define it ahead of time. But if you have a lot of unknowns or uncertainty about the project, Agile can help you deliver quality earlier while you build additional improvements and features and gain more knowledge through feedback and through the project itself. So here's one more visualization of that difference. So the icon on the left shows a representation of waterfall where there's a sequence of items. So first you finish A, and then B, and then C, and then the project delivers at the end and goes live. And then on the right, Agile is often represented as this kind of cycle that repeats. And these are shorter cycles of work to deliver bite-sized pieces of functionality or scope so the team can adapt to the new information that they're learning and incorporate that into the next cycle as needed. Now, Scrum. Scrum is a way of working together. So the term comes from rugby scrummage, which you can see as an illustration on the right. And you can really compare this to a more traditional relay race pattern of working together, like on the left. So Scrum is a way of working where you can quickly adapt to change. And it can feel creative, it can feel exciting, but as you can see from the image on the right, it can also be very chaotic and challenging, can know who's responsible for what, who's doing what. And so I think a lot of the processes defined in Scrum, like daily or weekly stand-up, backlog transparency, retrospectives, are all used to keep the collaborative process a little bit calmer and less overwhelming. And then finally, I just want to cover 3 more terms that you often hear in Agile and Scrum. So the first one is a product backlog, which is a prioritized list of work for the development team that is derived from a product roadmap. And this is often stored in a tool like Jira or Trello, Asana, GitLab, etc. But it can also be in a document or a spreadsheet, or I've even seen sticky notes on a whiteboard. A Kanban board is another tool, and it comes from lean manufacturing, and it's designed to visualize the work. So limit the amount of work your team currently has in progress, and maximize efficiency. And it often has columns like to do, doing, and done to organize what's currently being worked on in the sprint. And then finally, sprint is a short time box period when a Scrum team works to complete a set amount of work, often what's defined in the Kanban board. And a quick credit to Atlassian's Agile Coach site for the definitions on this slide. So now I'm going to transition to talking about how my teams adapted Agile and Scrum for our needs. So first, we have a charter document for Profile, treated as a living document, meaning it continues to change as we learn through Agile cycles. So the charter includes a roadmap section with most important scope and features prioritized first, and this guides the backlog prioritization and sprint planning conversations. And we have sponsor and stakeholder conversations early and often to stay clear on the highest priority scope. And we have a clear purpose and mission statement defined in the charter to make conversations around that MVP, minimum viable product, easier to have. So secondly, we adapt our roadmap to the Agile approach. So we create rough estimates by season, so summer, fall, spring, within the current fiscal year. And past year, we have a wish list of features, but we know that they're lower priority than the ones that we have for the fiscal year. And we avoid a rigidly scheduled waterfall approach. So rather than concentrating on specific dates or deadlines for all of these features that we would like to implement, we concentrate on communicating priority of features. So what are the features coming up in the next sprint or the sprint after? And then when we set priorities, we do consider the academic calendar events, enrollment cycles, things like that impact what we're going to weight as a higher priority than other issues, because we know the university has a kind of rigid academic calendar, but we don't try to force having a waterfall or mapped out calendar for all of those priorities again. And then we also adjust priority based on other campus projects that impact our work, such as ATP. And we allow the fiscal year roadmap to change. So based on stakeholder user feedback, we're able to adjust it. And we benefit from this because we're working in a changing, evolving environment. And so this approach helps us adapt and learn as we go. And so we expect our roadmap to change throughout the year. So how do we get comfortable with a changing roadmap? Well, first, we revisit the charter often, so at least every other month, so that annual planning can take less time and so that we are applying what we learn each sprint cycle. This doesn't mean overhauling the whole charter. It might just mean rewriting the scope of a particular item coming up in the future, or adjusting the priority of certain items based on what we're learning. We involve the whole team in mid-year and new year fiscal planning sessions. For example, an hour-and-a-half session with a 10-minute break in between to come up with new ideas, keep focused on the vision of the service. And we brainstorm in a virtual whiteboard called Mural during those meetings. And then we also use document version control in Google Docs to name versions of the charter docs so that we feel comfortable continually editing it. We don't feel like we're going to lose that history. And then also, because it is a Google Doc, team members and sponsors can add comments and questions, which I think is important for that transparency aspect of Scrum, but we keep it organized by working to resolve those comments and keeping the document from being cluttered. So I would say that keeping it from being cluttered is an important part of the process. I recommend if you do something like this, you edit down the amount of text. Originally, our charter started off very long, and it's been challenging to keep the text short as possible. And the longer the document, obviously, the harder it is to keep updated. And we use things like subheadings and bullets to organize the content. We let go of old information by having an appendix, which is a little easier than just completely deleting it. So we archive information, move completed work or completed roadmap milestones to the appendix at the end of the charter. And then we recognize the charter is not the same as the backlog. So the charter is meant for bigger picture goals and goals for the upcoming fiscal year. And then the backlog is where it gets more specific of what we're working on and what we're pulling into sprints. So for the backlog, we don't try to create every roadmap item in detail up front. Instead, we create backlog issues for near-term work, also called just-in-time refinement. And the longer-term items can stay in the charter roadmap. They don't need to be backlog issues in our issue board. So I recommend you don't try to map out everything in detail because things are going to change. And the more detail you put in ahead of time, the more difficult it will feel to adapt that, like that you've wasted perhaps time. So you can see it. There's an image on this slide on the right that shows 3 different kinds of types of refinement. So not enough is like everything's in a big bucket and nothing has detail. Too much, you've tried to really detail all the steps and subtasks of each roadmap item. And that, again, is just going to end up needing to change, and it's going to feel harder to change your priorities when that happens. So you want to just refine what you know is the highest priority, what's coming up, and then leave those future priorities as like bigger buckets or umbrella categories of work that you can refine closer to the time. And again, if you didn't need to change your roadmap, you probably could do waterfall, right? Like you could define your requirements pretty concretely upfront, but this style of work works well if there's other projects going on, other priorities, and you just don't know for sure exactly how things are going to play out. So here's an example of a backlog issue. My team uses GitLab issues, but there's a lot of tools out there. Even a spreadsheet or again, like sticky notes works. But for each issue, we try to make sure there's a description of why the issue is being done so that we have a shared understanding of what's being accomplished in the sprint. Again, that goes back to that Scrum image of like getting the ball across the goal line. You need to understand where the goal line is to consider it closed. Rather than use user story format, which you might be familiar with. So like as a student, I need to view my name and use so that I know how I'll appear in Zoom to others. We often fill in the prompt of what problem are we trying to solve. This helps if like there's a technical task that's maybe less specific to user experience, user story. But that doesn't mean we don't pay attention to user experience. And we do have UX check-in meetings, and we do place user experience highly in our guiding factor when roadmap planning. And we aim to have a clear issue of done. So how can you consider this issue closed? We have assignees added, but this can change as the issue moves through. You can add additional assignees, have like multiple assignees in GitLab. We store issues often in epics, which I'll talk about in the next slide. And then we have a shared understanding of how much work an issue is. So we use a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being very small and 5 being very great. And it's just relative to the other issues. So we don't try to map it to hours of work or any time or anything like that. It's just relative to the other issues on the board. How big might this issue be? And how much effort might it take to close? So epics. Sometimes epics seem like they're folders that you use to organize issues, but I would flip that and think of them as buckets that usually start empty. So they represent functionality or scope too big to finish in a single cycle or sprint. So issues you typically want to be able to finish in that cycle, whether it's two weeks or something like that. But if the work is, or the functionality is going to take longer than that, that's where epics come into play. And often we start with having empty epics and then refine those bite-sized pieces of work into issues just in time. We aim to have a clear definition of done on epics too, although sometimes we have to use sub-epics to achieve this, because it can be hard if an epic just indefinitely stays open, like improve user experience is kind of not well defined. Whereas here we have an example of one of our epics, the name and use administrative application. So having a definition of when this feature is delivered and the epic can be closed. Second to last, I want to show how we organize our sprints. So we use sprint names, which is a nice way to refer to a particular sprint. So you have an example of an Elvis Presley sprint. We did Rockstar sprints this fiscal year. Next year, we're doing wildflowers. So we have this Virginia Bluebell sprint. I'd recommend naming them all up front and just getting a calendar schedule in place so that that administrative work is just done and you don't have to schedule meetings throughout the fiscal year. You've just got it kind of set. And then it's easier to talk about a particular sprint, especially if you're planning like vacations or different things and you just want to, know kind of where things are going to be at. We have 2-week sprints in the fall and spring semesters, and then we have 3-week sprints in the summer, winter, holidays, and spring break. And this is really nice because then people feel like they can take vacations. The velocity of like how much work we get done is about the same, but it's a nice way to adapt to, again, time off and planning vacations. And then we also work to align our sprint schedule with the MyUW team and WPS client engagement team, which has been helpful to coordinate sprint schedules like that. And then finally, for my last slide, working with Scrum can be challenging if you have team members with split capacity, knowing that they are working on other projects or with other teams. And so instead of a daily stand-up, we have weekly Scrum meetings to check in on work that's been done, work we're planning to do, and any blockers. And it just works better with schedules. We meet in a Teams channel that's like persistent, so you can see the chat history and post text updates to it, which is nice, especially if you're going to miss the meeting. You can still post what you did, you're doing, and any blockers to be able to keep moving forward. And then part of the reason that we choose not to meet daily is our team members attend other stand-up or Scrum meetings, and our team crosses the org chart. So we have members from Identity and Access Management and then Web Platform Services and Application Infrastructure Services. And I think this is actually a nice strength because it keeps us connected to other teams, and having other stand-ups can kind of reveal connections that you might not know if you kind of stayed in a silo. So I think that even though it means that we don't, meet daily, I think that adaptation has been really helpful for our team. So that was a quick run through of how my team's using it. I'll be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A portion, and I'll drop a link to Profile Service and some of the other resources in the chat in a bit. And now I'll pass it over to Julie.
Julie, just so you know, you are still muted.
Sorry about that.
Great. We could see your screen before, but it looks like you stopped sharing briefly.
Yeah.
There we go.
I had to turn off the screen share so I could find my off mute button. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, old Zoom.
Thank you. Let's move on to Agile in a security context. My name is Julie Johnson. I work in testing and cyber defense, which is part of cybersecurity operations along with our SOC and our incident response team. Testing and cyber defense tends to be more proactive and setting up protections to prevent attacks before they happen. But there is still the element of security in that we have to respond to situations we do not control. My personal responsibilities include data loss prevention, which is protecting and safeguarding some of the most sensitive information UW has, social security numbers, banking information, and so on. Vulnerability management, we'll get into that in a couple later slides, but that's one of the most important responsibilities of TCD as a team. I also work on security reporting that tracks various benchmarks using scripts. Security uses Agile concepts in a lot of different ways and different teams within the Office of Cybersecurity. Now, I will focus on areas where I personally work within TCD, but I know that similar processes and similar adaptations of Agile concepts are used throughout the security team. We'll get into this. I got a whole slide for campus assessment of known exposure, which is vulnerability management. We also have a weekly stand-up that resembles a Scrum meeting. And our ticketing incorporates a lot of ideas from Kanban, even though we seldom use the word. Campus assessment of known exposure means managing a new vulnerability that has just been recognized. You can tell from the acronym that we have a foodie on our team that likes creating whimsical names. But vulnerability management is when you get down to what is actually happening serious. It starts with identifying a new vulnerability and we might hear about this in the media. We might hear about this from a vendor, from a blog, from a trusted third party. First, we have to assess the seriousness of a new vulnerability. Not all are serious enough or critical enough to be actionable on our part. If it is serious and the information we've seen checks out, our next step is to find out if the vulnerability is on campus and where it's being used. Then we decide as a group if notification is warranted. By this, we mean contacting the people that are using the software where the vulnerability exists and asking them to patch outside their normal patch cycle. We try to limit that to the most serious situations, but sometimes it's necessary. Now, sprint takes a much stronger meaning here in the sense that it is truly short. We don't have the luxury of a 2 or 3 week cycle to complete this as people in development do, because once a vulnerability becomes common knowledge, we can be very sure that the threat actors are working to find a way to exploit it. So therefore, we have to take sprint and compress the concept to an even shorter time frame. We try to finish in 1 working day if we possibly can. The priority for this kind of vulnerability management, this cake process as we call it, is intermediate. Some workflows, some tasks are on hold when we're working on a cake. Others are other things, especially if they involve previously scheduled meetings or coordinations with other departments, will go on as scheduled. That means we cannot, realistically speaking, get everyone together in real time for a Scrum ceremony or stand-up. Instead, we use teams to coordinate. The goals, though, are the same as in a Scrum meeting, in that we are maintaining transparency, working towards consensus, and we're equally important, we're following a packaged workflow. Just like a sprint cycle, we know the steps within the sprint. We've done it before, and that keeps things moving forward and minimizes the chance of errors. One difference between these cake processes and sprint plans in a development context is that each vulnerability is a new situation. It's not one iteration in a larger project, but a single event. And the next cake, when there will be one, is a different vulnerability with different variables. Our weekly stand-ups, we call them stand-ups, not scrum ceremonies, but the goals are very, very similar. All members of the team report what they're doing, maintain transparency, reach consensus on priorities, and keep everyone on the team aware of the current iteration of larger projects. Now, what Beth was describing as an epic is in those projects, the big projects, like the one I was most actively involved in was the upgrade from Spherion 11 to Spherion 12, which required new servers. Those are not organized into sprint plans. Those are the epic projects. And the reason is that TCD is a small team. And for our biggest projects, we often have to work with other teams with specialized skills. In the case of the Spherion upgrade, which is a security tool that needed new servers, we had to get help from the Windows team to stand up the servers and also coordinate with the DBA to create the new database. When we do things that require other teams, we work when resources are available, and that means we cannot lay out a sprint plan like Beth was showing us earlier with the calendar. That isn't realistic on our epics because of the way our situation looks. But we do maintain a flexible workflow. We do use the idea of flexibility, coordination, and consensus to keep a project like that moving forward when split capacity is something we all are working in. Now, I will be wrong to omit this, even to omit the issue of ticket management from discussions of how we use Agile-like concepts. At a glance, our ticketing system looks like classic help desk, but we've incorporated some of the ideas from Kanban into how we manage tickets. The visualization is a stairwell dashboard. I can't show you that because there's information there that's internal to cybersecurity, but it's a basic ticketing board that lists what's going on, each particular issue, and also has some benchmarks at the top of the board showing how many tickets are waiting in the queue in various categories. Some of the goals we definitely share with Kanban are limiting the items that are in progress at any given time, making the workflow as smooth, efficient, and organized as possible to keep things moving through the queue, and to keep any ticket from waiting too long. It also encourages people, by being a flexible system, it allows people to do what they do best at least some of the time. Obviously, no one can pick and choose their work all the time, but people do have types of tickets they're especially good at and prefer to work on, and they can take those from the board and take ownership of them, which is not only an efficient way to make the best use of different people's skill sets, but it also has the advantage of helping with morale. People are doing what they prefer to do some of the time. Now, again, like I said with our sprints, with the cake issues, most tickets are distinct requests or problems, so they are not part of a larger epic, as Beth was talking about. They are, however, part of the security process, and therefore we do have to keep the big picture in perspective, even though each ticket is an individual issue. Overall, cybersecurity has adapted Agile processes and workflows when they are applicable to the work we're doing. And there are times when the methodology is a great benefit. There are other times when it doesn't really apply. But one of the strengths of Agile is you don't have to either apply it or not apply it in a binary sense. You can apply it where it works and not apply it in a way that if there are areas where Agile concepts would not be applicable. We use it where it helps us. And I think when Lucas shares how Agile is applied in operational sense, you'll see how Agile methodology works there as well. Are you ready, Lucas?
I am.
Take it from here.
All right. One moment here while I queue up the screen share. All right, can everyone see that screen? All right. So first off, I am a dad. I have a pair of boys, 1 and 3 years old, so I have to be very agile, and I'm sprinting a lot. More related to the work sense, here at UW, I'm in the SMPH's Informatics and IT group as a DevOps cloud engineer. Been here a little over 2 years. And in this role, we use Scrum and Kanban, where we use a lot of the Agile methodologies. And our usage is actually fairly similar to what Beth showed. Current set of sprints even are named after Star Wars planets. For 5 years prior to that, I was in cybersecurity at Foot Locker. I joined Foot Locker in the middle of a big push to go all in on Agile across the entire IT organization. But before I dive into my experience with Agile, I just want to make a couple observations for context. Agile itself has its roots in automobile manufacturing, so it certainly can be applied beyond software development. And I think where and how you apply Agile methodologies, like how you're going to change how your team actually works, should start with what the team is producing and delivering, your goals. Because the farther your goals get from tangible like artifacts, from producing something that can be planned and measured and validated, I think the trickier it is to actually use Agile. So it really lends itself to roles that are delivery focused. And another thing to note is that when it comes to Scrum here on the left, it's a whole framework, a whole way of applying Agile ideas to work processes, and it changes, or certainly can change, a lot of how a team works. Whereas on the other side, Kanban on the right there, it's a project management tool. It can be used with or without Scrum, and it doesn't necessarily even benefit from Scrum roles per se. It really helps with prioritizing and breaking down work into manageable chunks, but it doesn't need to mean sweeping changes to the way you work. So Kanban can be fairly easy to implement, Scrum often a larger shift. And I'll actually leave on the slide because it's relevant to my work experience in that my first encounter with Agile at Foot Locker. I was a security architect. As I mentioned, there was an IT org-wide push to using Agile right as I started back as a security analyst, actually. And there were really mixed results across the organization. Different roles seemed to really benefit from it. Others really struggled. Help desk, for example, struggled with the idea. Their work was regular, but kind of too atomic, too small to effectively track well this way. And the planning, the deliverables, their work simply didn't align with the things that Agile provided as benefits. Speaking for cybersecurity even, we attempted to use Scrum across the whole department, but in the end, we kind of decided to forego Scrum entirely. The engineers and the architects used Kanban because we had deliverables. We were working with specific projects, we're providing risk assessments, things of that nature. The analysts, ultimately, they went away from Kanban. Their work wasn't aligned well with the kind of measurable deliverables, but it's actually really important to note that even when the team didn't use it for the team's work, they still did interact with it with specific projects or like advisory boards that use Kanban boards. It really actually greatly benefited like a multi-department project or a multi-department advisory board to track their work in one common place where you had a work item that followed the whole life cycle of what they're delivering, for example, like a risk assessment or something of that nature. So there's a great benefit for using Kanban in particular when you're spanning multiple departments or work groups, I think. Here at UW, I work in, we use both Scrum and Kanban. I'm a DevOps cloud engineer in SMPH's Informatics and IT. I do love Beth's paradigm shift diagram. So I borrowed the Agile triangle for this part. What we do is actually kind of close to software development. We work with code, we deliver projects to our end users. What we're working with is measurable. We can plan for it for the most part. And we have deliverables. We deliver bodies of code or a server to a project, that sort of thing. Even in our team, which kind of lends itself to the workflows that Agile was developed for from a software development perspective, there's still some things, some parts of this triangle we do have to keep revisiting. The accurately assessing capacity, especially with regards to unplanned work, so this is going to be like the resource triangle there, are the personnel and the time we have, the capacity we have to complete work. It's something that we really need to revisit periodically. And importantly, you need to think ahead when it comes to unplanned work. It happens even with really well-structured teams and well-structured projects. There'll be something you didn't plan for. There'll be a bug that's stopping all work for some of your end users. So it's something you want to make sure that you budget capacity for. If you've estimated you have a certain amount of capacity, set aside some of it for unplanned work. And then also, the other thing you have to kind of continually revisit is how long is work going to take? What is the scope of the plant or the time triangle there? As we better understand how we can break things down into manageable chunks, it becomes better and easier, and we are continually improving at properly estimating our effort and not having to take a carry for one sprint to another. So I'm going to keep it short so we can get to make sure there's time for the Q&A. So I'm going to conclude here. So I think if you're considering Agile, like whether it's Scrum, Kanban, whatever it is, I think it's important to ask yourself, what's the reason you're considering that change? Is this to allow for better work tracking or to generate reports? Is it for individuals to better manage their workload? Is it for a specific project? Is it for an entire team and their entire workload? Is it really just because you need a single place where everyone's tracking all their work on the same page? Because those are all potential benefits of Agile, but there are also some non-Agile methodologies that might be able to meet some of those needs. And it's really good to know what is your driver when you're adopting something like Agile, something new. If you can figure out the specific thing you want to change, you can figure out, is Kanban the right fit, is Scrum the right fit, both, or something else altogether. So I think it's also really important. I think in the past 10 years, this has become an easier conversation for some. Don't treat it as an all or nothing proposition. For a while, there was like Agile all the way for everything. Everyone does need to be on the same page, but that doesn't mean adopting the whole Agile book. Agile is versatile. It does offer a lot of benefits. So identify which ones would work best for your team and just pursue those, at least to start. So with that, I will hand it back over. We can have some Q&A as soon as I find there we go.
Thanks so much, Lucas. Thanks all of the panelists for your great presentations. All right, so we're moving into Q&A. I have a few from the chat that I'll share, but as a reminder to folks, please do feel free to drop those questions in the chat and I will ask them of our panelists. So I'll start with a question from James Volkovsky. James asks, are your teams dedicated to a single project at a time, or must they balance multiple competing projects simultaneously? I'll say this is a question that resonates with me, so I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, I can jump in because I know I had a slide on that kind of split capacity conversation. So there are team members on my service that are some are 100% capacity to the project and some are split capacity. And so they are working on with other teams and also on other projects. And how much capacity they have dedicated to those other projects sometimes fluctuates and changes depending on what is going on. So I think the way that we handle this is through being able to measure velocity, or how many sprint issues can you close each cycle. So how many sprint issues do we get done each sprint? And I think that's where it's handy to give them a weight, like the 1 to 5 scale we use, because then you can also see how many issues close, but also how many points close, like how much of that estimated work. And I think the best way to kind of see what the general capacity is to monitor it for a few sprints, which is going to take that kind of storming period, like storming, forming, norming, if you've heard that phrase, of like just understanding, okay, per sprint, what's about what we can handle, and encouraging people to do things like use their calendar to block off focus time, work blocks, and I think the folks on my team do a really good job of knowing their own schedule and like how much they can take on, and encouraging people to, during sprint planning, say like, is this okay? Do you have enough work? If you feel like you don't have enough work, we can look at that too and like pull more issues from the backlog. I think that's still a challenge, like it is, because it just depends on what's going on per semester or the time of year. But yeah, that I would say that's why having points on the backlog issues can really help, because you can do a graph to measure that over time.
Thank you. That's a really helpful strategy. Julie or Lucas, anything to say about that?
I can say that in security, no one is dedicated to a single project 100%. That just does not happen in security. It's in the nature of the work we're doing. We also have to deal with, now in TCD, we're not incident response, so we're not on the front line if something significant happens, but sometimes we're called in to help the incident response if something serious happens. And we have cakes, which we want to resolve in a day if we can. And then we have the longer projects like upgrades and evaluating new tools, which can take weeks or even months. So we have to balance that. That's part of where we've incorporated, where our weekly stand-ups or scrums are very, very critical. Most of the tickets, the bulk of the tickets are handled by student helpers, but there are some that require a full-time employee. That part works very well because people know what their individual responsibilities are there. It's all getting everything to work as a whole that is much of a charter.
Sure. Thank you. Lucas, anything to add?
I think, yeah, between Beth and Julie, they answer pretty well. I guess I'll just say that yes, we definitely balance multiple things.
Guessing there are a lot of people here who feel that way. I have a follow-up question. We have the time. So related to that, as we talked about in Agile's, you sprint. So if you are always sprinting when you're doing Agile, how do you avoid feeling that burnout after a while from moving so quickly on so many things?
If I can lead off on that one. We have tech sprints planned regularly, and we plan them ahead of time. So right now we're trying out a quarterly cadence, see if we can get one sprint in per quarter. Mm-hmm. And the idea there is that's dedicated to what the team has identified as, okay, here's an improvement we'd really like to make, but all of our our top priorities that are always at the top are preventing us from making that. Or here's a system that we really know needs an upgrade. Like there's nothing insecure about it, but it's not delivering something that we need from it. Or we want to adopt this new technology, like all those sorts of things. The things that we would love to just like kind of, I hesitate to say play around with, but the things we know would be a benefit, but we just never get the time to do. And that's really, for me at least, it's really life-bringing, life-giving, in terms of keeping me engaged and excited about the work. And we get a cool tool out at the end of the day quite often.
Cool. Yeah. Julie or Beth?
I guess I think this is where definitely the tools of Scrum come into play to help. So like the retrospectives, I think can be a good temperature check to see if people are feeling stressed out. A lot of times those, typically you'll have the like, what should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? My team often uses like, what went well, what were some of our strengths, what are we worried about? And there's a lot, if you just search like Agile retrospective template, there's so many variations on that are like themed and like have different prompts. But I think that can be a good temperature check to see if people are feeling burned out. And then also, again, I think of the velocity charts and seeing what's reasonable to pull into a sprint. And in my experience, even before when I was at the school business, I think the challenge is getting people to pull things out of the sprint rather than like, you know, like I think the tendency I've seen is to want to put a lot in and see how it's all connected and really getting people to answer like, okay, what's the next step? What's the next stepping stone to get where we want to go? Let's really focus on that and not try to pull everything in, because I think that gets to be where it's hard to manage the scope and the energy level. So.
Thank you. Julie, anything to add?
It's a different situation in security because some of our sprint cycles are so short. But the nice thing about them being short is that they're over. Once we get the notification sent out after a cake, that one's done. We can wrap it up and get back to other projects.
Great.
But the nature of security with a certain level of unpredictability is something that the people that work in it just have to be comfortable with. And those of us that thrive in security careers have gotten comfortable with not knowing what we might be doing that day. That's our world. Some things that are part of the epic projects, we also know that they don't always have the highest priority, that deadlines might slip, that again, we get comfortable working in the realities and in the position and career we've chosen.
Thank you. I'll read Alan's comment from the chat because I fully agree. Alan Eng says that it's important to clarify the term sprint shouldn't necessarily be interpreted as implying the analogy of a non-sustainable pace. It's just a contrast from non-agile methods to plan long, large chunks of work that are bigger than a sprint. Alan, I agree. I find sprints pretty manageable myself too. It makes me feel better about the work. What Beth said really segued nicely into James Folkowski's second question from earlier, so I will bring that up now. James asked, how does maintenance or fixes to old products like legacy products, how does all of that get included in your backlogs? Because Beth, you talked about not including everything and the kitchen sink in your sprints, but how do you deal with those backlog items?
Yeah, well, we are a newer service, so our Qiskit queue is fairly short compared to other services. Not all help, like for example, help desk incidents become issues in our backlog. So I would say the backlog is typically more about like those feature improvements and like what we're building on. But sometimes based on what, you know, if there's a help desk incident that reveals a bug that needs to be fixed, or a thing we want to change that, you know, it's like feedback about how we're doing something, that does become a backlog issue. And so we're, you know, we can add labels to that in GitLab to see that it came, you know, from Qiskit and was originally like a help desk incident, but we don't try to automatically load everything from like those kinds of customer requests into the backlog. The backlog, I would say, really gets generated from that roadmap, the product roadmap. So.
Thank you. Lucas or Julie, anything to add about that?
Yeah, those so tech sprints help for some of the ones where we kind of identify just needs to happen. Sometimes it will depend on the criticality of the system and like what's impacting. So if there's a cybersecurity issue, that actually helps bubble that up to the top pretty quick if it's a a critical severity or something of that nature. Also really helpful is kind of when we implement something, we try to automate it as much as possible, including the maintenance. So we'll have like a automated patching, automated like tests to validate that a patch is successful, things like that. Because as much as possible, we don't want to, deploy 40 applications and then have 40% less capacity because now we're trying to maintain these 40 applications sort of thing. So we would love for as much of that maintenance to be automated as possible. So kind of two ways of approaching it.
Yeah, Julie?
I don't really have anything to add here because what Lucas said was pretty much what I was going to say.
Great,
I don't
thank
really
you.
have any more to add on that one. Thanks, Lucas.
All right.
Thanks, Beth.
I do want to acknowledge Dan Fitch asked a question in the chat about the GitLab tag taxonomy, which Beth answered in the chat. If we have time at the end for the benefit of those watching, I'll read that later, but I'm going to jump to a question that came in from Scott Reeser. How do you decide if an aspect or problem you want to work on is an epic that goes over several sprints, perhaps, versus a single ticket item that might be done in one sprint?
Well, I'll jump in and say, when I was at the School of Business, I felt like we did this a little bit where we would do, we'd start making the issues and then it would become kind of clear that it needed an epic, right? Like there wasn't a way to get this done in a 2-week period. In the current service, I do feel like I sometimes think of epics more as folders. So that like warning of like, you don't need to create epics every time. I do feel like I tend to lean towards that, because they are a nice placeholder, right? Like if you're trying to roadmap out and you know things are coming down the pipeline, they are a nice, like that bigger bucket without needing to create a bunch of smaller issues. So I would say if it's a roadmap item, that's where it's like, it's probably going to be an epic. And then I would say, don't be afraid to delete epics or even delete issues. So like if you made it an epic and then as you're refining it with the team in a refinement meeting, and it only has like 2 issues in it, and you're like, we could do this in a single sprint. Maybe it doesn't need an epic. Maybe you could just use labels, because labels don't have to be closable, right? In fact, I would say labels probably shouldn't be closable. They can keep being used over and over. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
The difference in security, because of the kind of work we're doing, it's obvious what's an epic, what's a big project, and what's a sprint based on priority. Vulnerabilities have to be addressed within hours if they're the most serious ones, or at the longest within a couple of days. In the case of an upgrade, that will by its nature have a lower priority, and that means it's a project.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah, I would say don't be afraid to switch from one work item to another if your platform allows you to, or like Beth said, to delete one and create one. And part of that is like when you're planning things out, we use like a point system where we assign a point value to try and figure out this is how much effort it's going to take. And if the point value is high and we can't figure out a way to get it smaller without like creating additional tickets, then it probably was an epic anyway. And so we'll just turn it into an epic. I would say try not to get caught up on the epic. Don't think, Hollywood 3-hour-long movie necessarily. It's just like, I think a bucket is a good way to put it. The other time I would prefer to use epics is when it's work that's crossing between groups. So if it's not just DevOps, but it's DevOps and another group like interface engineers that aren't normally like paired together on something, then an epic's probably a good way to allow then for it to be broken down in like a story, one for the DevOps and one for the interface engineer sort of thing.
Yeah. Julie, what you're talking about reminds me of another question I've got, which is how do you coordinate when some security work is in sprints? And as you talked about earlier, some just can't be. So how are you coordinating those two things?
The stand-up is very, very important. We try to reach a consensus on that. We also, most projects, in fact, all the big ones, have a member of the team that's designated project manager that keeps track of where everything is. Even if, say, I'm the project manager, like with the Spherion upgrade, there's tasks there that I cannot do. I can't create a database at a scale that we needed for that particular upgrade, but I have to work with the database, the DBA team to make sure that gets done, check it off, make sure it's tested, and so on. Now that was a little more complicated than it sounds because we had a project manager handoff during that project. One of my coworkers managed it at the beginning and then I managed it at the end. But even then, And that was at a point where the stand-up is particularly important to make sure that someone stepping up knows what's been done, what has not been done, and who we're communicating with to coordinate. That's where teamwork, consensus, transparency, all of the things that are so important to Agile methodology are particularly important to us because we have varied priorities.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I do have another question from Dan, but other folks, please do feel free to keep asking questions in the chat. Dan Fitch asks, Dan is curious to hear if anyone is doing continuous integration or continuous deployment. If you could talk about that, if you are. Lucas, I see you unmuted.
So yeah, I'm in DevOps, so this is my bread and butter. I love automation. That's what drew me to DevOps. So yes, we're definitely doing continuous integration, continuous deployment. We've got a couple different tools. GitLab's a great tool that the university's got that ultimate license, allows you to do so much. Continuous deployment, having testing in there is something we are doing increasingly, and it's been fantastic from that perspective of not carrying forward maintenance from the perspective of you can even automatically say just every month run this code with the latest version. If it doesn't fail, then we can get to the point of pushing out. So we're still even maturing there, but yeah, getting to that point is just, it's huge for allowing a smaller team to accomplish more work quickly and to scale out. So and love to talk about that more with others offline if anyone wants to.
Great, thank you. Julie or Beth, any thoughts?
I'll jump in and say we use GitLab, obviously, like I showed for our issue board, but also pipelines in there for testing. I know Scott Reeser's on, and he's on the profile team, so shout out to Scott for a lot of the pipeline work that he's done there. A lot of that is automated testing right now, so testing tools that we can use to check merge requests and things that are changing about our source code. But I think that is a real benefit of having our backlog and our issue tracking right next to our repository or within it, because so much of it can be tied together. So
Great.
The security isn't doing development per se. That wouldn't really apply to us. We do use GitLab for version control in some sprint projects, but we don't push it out to development.
Okay. Well, with that mention of GitLab, since we have the time for any nerds watching this later who would like to know about the GitLab tax taxonomy, I will read what Beth responded with. Unless Beth wants, Beth, would you prefer, or I'm happy to read it?
I can read it.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, so that was a question from Danielle Fitch of how do you arrive at GitLab tag taxonomy? And our tags labels have definitely grown over time. So I would say first, just let it grow organically. That might feel messy, but you can always delete labels or tags. So if you want to clean it up or rename them, I think, you know, that a lot of the tools out there, including GitLab, allow for that, being able to organize them more over time. And we use labels often on how we might categorize work. So examples, user interface, data synchronization, bug, user licensing, CI/CD pipelines, etc. And I think don't try to make them all equivalent, because that would be really hard to like have it be like, you know, like you're trying to tag blog posts and make it really super consumable. I would say let it be a little more organic than that. And then if we want to be able to report on issues, so like having an incident label to be able to say how many issues did we tag with that were tied to a Qiskit incident. And then scoped labels in GitLab, I think, are especially helpful. These are GitLab labels where only one label can be applied to an issue in the scope. So the scope might be priority, and then you have different like priority : low, priority : high. And so if you apply one scoped label, it will remove if there was already a label on it. So if it was already tagged with priority low and you tag it with priority high, it'll drop that first one and only allow one in that category. And I did drop a link in the chat to GitLab's page on scope labels, but we use that for priorities. So high, medium, low, nice to have. And then status too. So if something's refined, which means we've talked about it, it's ready to pull into a sprint, in progress, and then on hold. And in GitLab, those labels are also how you can like make the Kanban board work. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That was the appropriate level of geek and detail that I know our folks are going to want to hear later. So we have run out of time. I want to thank Beth, Julie, and Lucas again for a great panel and some great discussion and Q&A. I am sure they would be happy to answer any additional questions by email. Thanks everyone for attending. There's still a pair of presentations left today to attend at the IT Professionals Conference. We hope to see you there. Take a short break and we'll see you again soon. Thank you so much.